Hello, welcome to Big Guy Boards. This is going to be my second in a series of videos focused on longboarding. In this video I'm going to be talking about how to make the transition from a longer board down to shorter, less volume surfboards. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to talk about is some of my own experience and how I started to learn on longboards and just some advice I could give based on that. So the reason I'm making this video is I've seen loads of posts either on the Big Guy Boards forum or on other surfing pages on Facebook and other social media platforms, and lots of people are talking about making a transition from longboards down to smaller boards and I'm asking for advice on it. There was one interest, the thing that made me make this video was there was one specific post on the Big Guy Boards forum recently about a guy transitioning down, and I thought I've done this myself, I've got a bit of experience doing it, so I thought I'd make the video myself. Okay, so I'm just going to start by talking about some of my experience of riding longboards. I started learning on longboards straight away. My dad rode longboards for years. He's always had a shed full of boards, so that's what I started to learn on straight away. And I'd say for a beginner level surfer, especially someone who needs more volume, whether you're heavier or any other reason, it's a great thing to do just to get you in the water and paddling around, getting used to being in the water, getting used to catching waves. It's really good for that, especially if you're a heavier surfer. You need more foam. It's hard to find. I've seen so many examples of people who have been guided towards a mini mow or similar board with a kind of mid-range type of volume, and it just makes the learning process so much more difficult. So initially I would say being a longboard really helps, but then I probably made a bit of a mistake and I stayed on longboards for too long. And as you start to move from beginner to intermediate, and if you're interested in riding shortboards, I would probably say it's going to be much steeper a learning curve or much more difficult to make the transition if you're kind of intermediate level on a longboard and then you try and go to a shortboard. So my advice there would be, once you've got used to paddling and being in the water, and you've got the kind of beginner basics down, you can stand up, you can go down the line, I'd say sooner rather than later you want to find more of a manoeuvrable kind of really chunky hybrid type board. So I've done a different video talking about beginner to intermediate for heavier surfers. I'll put the link here. That gives a couple of examples of the type of board I'd recommend, but more recently we've kind of developed a really high volume fish shape, but it's got a similar volume to a longboard, but it's much more manoeuvrable, and I'd definitely recommend something along those lines for someone who is is a beginner surfer but has aspirations to get to an intermediate plus, and wants to ride smaller boards. So it's much more manoeuvrable, but it's got all the float and paddleability of a longboard, but it just will massively ease the transition from a longboard into a shortboard. So that's the baboon fish. You can check that out at bigguyboards.com. So back to my kind of experience. So once I'd kind of got a lot of the basics worked out and I started to transition into a intermediate surfer, this is the board I was on. So you can see that's a Neville. I'm not sure exactly the model. If I can find out what it is, I'll put it in the link below. But basically I'd call it kind of a hybrid shape. So dimensions 9 to 22 9/16, 2 3/4. So I would say it's leaning slightly more towards a performance male, but it's still got quite a lot of width in the nose, so relatively good for nose riding still. But it's a pulled in tail. You've got quite hard rails at the back, and obviously dimensions wise it's slightly thinner, and not stick this way as well. So it's kind of starting to lean towards more performance longboarding, but it's still kind of a, yeah, what I would call a hybrid really. So I was on this for quite a while, a good few years. Obviously you can see it's in a bit of a state now, but it's just been sitting in the shed and very rarely gets used now. But I moved from this, as I was starting to move into intermediate, I really liked surfing my local beach break at low tide when it gets quite heavy. So I went to a local shaper, Paul Blacker, told him about that, told him what I wanted. I generally only went out in shoulder high above. I didn't really like it when it was small at that point. I liked kind of chunky size waves. And he shaped this board, which was absolutely unbelievable. It only came alive in around shoulder high. Anything below, which is weird for a longboard, it just wouldn't work. That could be down to the rocker or a number of other things. So that was just an absolutely amazing board. It was a bit of a weird shape. So the local breaker was called Paul Blacker. It was a Blacker surfboard, and it's called Ugly Fish. And had a squared off nose. I haven't got it now because I snapped it, which I'll tell you in a minute. It had a squared off nose, a fish tail, like a swallowtail, but it was just unreal. As soon as the wave got to any half decent size, it was a magic board. It was just one of those magic boards. So I took that to Indo. I think it was my first trip to Indo, and it was during the season. There's quite some solid swells, and that got snapped clean in half. Which is, you probably imagine, is quite likely riding a longboard in quite steep hollow waves. And that's when I started making my first transition onto shortboards, which I'll talk about next. Okay, so I was riding my Ugly Fish in Bali. Dimensions of that, I'll try and find some pictures and see if I can overlay those on this video. Dimensions were 8.6. I think it was around 2 3/4 stick again. I'm guessing the dimensions here, and I think it was similar width to this, maybe slightly smaller, so maybe around 22 thick, 22 wide. I'll try and get those dimensions. I'll put them up. I'll put them in the description below if I can find them. As I said, it was a magic board. I took it to Bali. During the season, there were some solid swells, and yeah, it just snapped clean in half. I'd always been thinking about riding shortboards. And I tried it a few times here, but I'd gone from either this or something similar onto a mate's shortboard, a smaller friend as well, and it just felt horrible. And I thought, there's no way I'm ever going to be able to do this. I couldn't paddle it. It just felt kind of laterally weird as I was in the water trying to catch a wave. I just felt completely unstable, obviously with the reduced width as well. And I just thought, there's no way I can do this, so I just kind of gave up on that, stuck with longboarding. And then in Bali, the waves are more powerful. I thought, I'm going to have another go at this, and I went to Kuta. This was quite a few years ago. Found a decent sized shortboard. I think it was about 6'5". Within about a week of surfing every day, I started to get on with it. I could start going down the line. I felt comfortable on the board, but it's really important to note with that I was surfing every day in Bali, and I was in Java at the time as well. I moved to Java, West Java, and from surfing every day, surfing in your underpants, surfing powerful waves, consistent waves every day. I managed to make the transition within about a week or so. I tried a few different boards as well. I snapped a couple of shortboards while I was out there, so I tried a range of different boards, and they're all around the 6'5", 6'6" mark. I was a bit lighter than I am now. They're probably around, no one was really doing anything above 22 wide then, so probably around 19 and a half wide. So I then kind of had the belief that I could make a transition. But then I came back to the UK, and I just found it so hard to have any kind of consistency in my surfing on smaller boards, because the waves aren't as powerful here, it's not as consistent. You're in a 5mm suit in the winter, and I just found it really difficult, and it really knocked my confidence and knocked my surfing. And so I think that's the difficulties a lot of people have with transitioning from longboards to shortboards. It's just the complete difference in, as I've said, the width, the difference in volume, the whole feel, and it can really knock your confidence. Unless you're surfing perfect waves, it's really difficult to do. So that's why I would say, as I said previously, start once you've got the real fundamentals down. My first bit of advice would be start on more of a kind of a high volume hybrid or fish shape. Um, so if you head to bigguyboards.com and check the baboon, that's a really good example of something you could ride. And as I said, I did another video where I'll talk about other options as well. So now I'm going to talk about how I eventually made the transition from a longboard to a shortboard in junky UK waves. Okay, so the board I bought back from Indo, I think was a 6.5. It's probably a bit too small for me. This is just pre-volume era, so I didn't know exactly what kind of size board I should be on. I didn't go to a shaper in Bali. I just picked one up off the rack, a second-hand one, the biggest one I could find, basically. That was definitely too small for me, especially for UK waves without any power. So I really struggled with it. At the time I was surfing mostly beach break, which again kind of compounded that and made it a bit more difficult. And yeah, in the winter as well with a wetsuit. So it was a real struggle, and I was having a really bad time. I can't remember. I think I might have gone back to longboarding for a short time. But then for some reason I started thinking about looking at fish surfboards, like a traditional fish. I'm not sure what started me on that route. I don't think anyone advised me. I just thought it might. I think I'd seen a lot of people riding them, and it looked like it just might slightly ease the transition. So I ended up getting a 6.2. It's called a speed dialer model, and it was by a really good local guy, Diplock. So it was Bro at Diplock. It wasn't a custom, it was just off the rack, but it was 6.2, decent amount of volume. Probably at the time, my weight at the time, it was just slightly on the low end of the volume I should have been at, but it was kind of enough volume basically just to get me going. And that really eased the transition. So the beauty with a fish surfboard is it's not quite as twitchy as a shortboard. There's a bit more width generally to give you more stability. So that's really important with the width of a surfboard. If you're lying on the board, the wider the board is, the more stable it is in the water. And if you imagine a thinner board, it's going to be doing that a lot more, which is going to feel really unstable as you take off. So that really helped. Paddling wise as well, because they're got a wider template all the way through the board, and a flatter rocker as well. It just planes a lot more as well. But you're still making a transition on a shorter board because you can still move it around similar to a short board. You're still coming down in volume, but it really eases that transition. And I found for me, it was still a slower process, but it really helped my transition to a short board. From there, I then started getting bigger short boards. I started on kind of 6.8, but at the time, again, short boards weren't that shortboard was a bit thinner still. There wasn't as much of a trend for them to be kind of fatter and wider. So I was probably on 6.8, started on, and then started to slowly progress down from there. Okay, so to summarise, from my own experience, my advice would be start on a longboard, but as quickly as you can. As soon as you get the fundamentals down, the basics, you can stand up on a few waves, maybe just starting to go down the line, surf on the green part of the wave. At that point, I would start looking at getting away from longboards and getting on something like a chunky hybrid type of board. Otherwise, from my experience, it takes much longer to make that transition. But if you're already on a longboard and you've stuck with a longboard, you're kind of getting towards the intermediate level and you're starting to look at making a transition down, I think the best board definitely to do it, from my experience, is a fish. And I would say, depending on obviously your weight and everything else, your ability, I'd say just go slightly higher in volume at this point. Definitely foam is your friend. I talk about volume in different videos and how I come down in volume for different waves and things, but I think if you're just making a transition from a longboard down to something smaller, definitely get a bit more foam. Don't be afraid of making a bit more float, because you're transitioning from something with potentially a lot more volume. Um, so definitely, if you're a bigger surfer, definitely way over a 6 foot kind of fishy or hybrid type of shape. And then you can slowly bring the transition down from there. I notice a lot of people, a lot of surfers try and make too big a jump from when they're transitioning down, so they go from like a high volume fish down to a little toothpick shortboard, which is again going to really slow your progress. So just make small steps down, basically, would be my advice.